Only 3 years in, and I'm starting to regret my decision.
It'll be rewarding, they say.
Today we are ranking over 40 death metal albums from 1992, and we're starting with Deicide with Legion. The band considers this album to be its most difficult in its technicality and definitely sounds chaotic right from the beginning with Satan's Spawn. I can even hear elements of this album that were likely an inspiration to mathcore bands later in this same decade. Dead But Dreaming is strangely hypnotic, Trifixion fucking shreds, Revocate the Agitator is pummeling, and in spite of the chaos, it's a very tight album at just 8 tracks, over 29 minutes. It is going to perfection. Next up is Autopsy with Acts of the Unspeakable. This is a particularly repetitious album. I've never been a fan of that approach to songwriting in general. I'd also argue this is among their doomiest albums overall, which is already a downside for me, but then even the faster parts here fail to get me moving or feeling anything. Very boring, kind of weak production. I actually don't even think there's a single track I can highlight on this one aside from maybe Battery Acid Enema, so this one is going to meh. Then we have Asphyx with Last on Earth. The Dutch death metalers back with their second album. Kind of sad when you know that Martin recorded his vocals alone, apparently not knowing he had already been kicked out of the band at the time. Regardless, strong performance from him and lots of great guitar work too. Serenade in Lead is a rager in particular, really still holding on to a lot of that original death sound. And even as your resident doom hater, I enjoy this quite a bit thanks to the great pacing. There are plenty of slower moments, but they never linger on any of them long enough for me to get bored. Common favorite among fans, I'm going to put it at amazing. Next up is Hypocrisy with Penetralia. If you ask me, Hypocrisy is a much better melodeath band than this more standard death metal debut. They're working off of the same overall blueprint of their fellow Swedes, but I just don't think there was much of a grasp on writing as good of songs. Tracks are frequently repetitive, and I find the vocals pretty irritating. Good band, but definitely not the best for a debut. I'm going to put this one at okay. Then we have Mortification with Scrolls of the Megilloth. The Australian Christian death metalers back for their sophomore effort, continuing with some similar elements as the debut, but leaning much more into death metal and away from thrash and grind. The songs feel tighter and more imposing. Love Terminate Damnation, more great speed on Eternal Lamentation, killer bass on Raise the Chalice, nice atmospheric touches on the Raging Requiem. But there are others like Lymphosarcoma that I find a little repetitious and annoying. Good stuff, but just has a hard time competing with some of the higher stuff here. So I'm going to put it at good. Then we have At the Gates with The Red in the Sky Is Ours. Another band that definitely didn't quite have their sound yet on the first album, with almost more of a grindy vibe in some areas. Also, the guitars and drums have kind of an early black metal sound. I like the use of strings and just further emphasizing even more of the melodic side of the guitar sound that at this point had been driven largely by the likes of Entombed and Dismember in a more straightforward and heavy direction. They only got better from here, but within the context of what was coming out this year, it's cool to see them just carving out what would become known as the Gothenburg sound. I'm putting this one at fantastic, and I just realized I already messed up. Expect me to probably do this more. This one was, Asphyx was at amazing. Yo, we have so many more albums to go, but if you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to hit the like button and also comment below your favorite death metal albums from 1992. Let me know where you agree, where you disagree. This is all just my opinion, and if you're new here, subscribe because I do videos like this twice a week. But next up, we have Amorphous with the Carillion Isthmus. This band has gone through a lot of iterations of their sound, but this debut is an interesting mix of old school and melodic death metal. I'd compare it most closely to Dark Tranquillity's The Gallery, but interwoven with some early Amon Amarth. I dig the subtle synth atmosphere, but the songwriting can be a little bit clunky, and the vocal performances leave something to be desired. Another more unique listen on here, I'm going to put it at great tier. Then we have Malevolent Creation with Retribution. These Florida legends following up an already strong debut, and this time with Rob Barrett of Cannibal Corpse on lead for even more vicious results. Great riffing that feels like scorching flames all around alongside the unnerving rumble of the bass, and another intense vocal performance from Brett. That scream on Coronation of Our Domain alone is worth checking out. Pure speeded violence all the way through, just the way I like it. No lulls, no breaks, and great production too. It flies by at around 30 minutes and leaves me wanting to start it all over again, so it is going to perfection. Then there's Morpheus Descends with Ritual of Infinity. The only full-length album from this New York death metal band. Pretty standard buzzy death metal with a fairly muddled live-sounding production job and pretty Cannibal Corpse-like vocals. It's solid and enjoyable, but also feels kind of forgettable in comparison to some of the other choices here. Kind of the definition of meat and potatoes to me. So it's going to meh. And I want to reiterate that really every album on this list has something to enjoy. I don't think there are any truly bad albums on here. I really don't like this Autopsy record, but it's still, you know, it's got its charm. Then we have Incantation with Onward to Golgotha. Despite not being a huge fan of this band in general, this is one of the albums I do think is worthy of your time. Very cavernous sound like blazing hellfire. I could see how this was probably an influence on the likes of Portal and Alterage. The drums sound great, love the atmosphere. It's very dark and evil sounding, but I will say it starts to get a little repetitive again, even just a few tracks in. Even so, it's got some killer moments, and as one of the higher fan-rated albums on Metal Storm, I think it deserves to be at least probably at great tier. Then we have Edge of Sanity with Unorthodox. My biggest complaint of the debut was that it just wasn't really doing anything to stand out, but with the effectively titled Unorthodox, they have remedied that problem big time. Right from the top, Enigma takes some pretty drastic twists and turns from your more standard OSDM tropes to organ and clean singing to big melodeath atmosphere. I'd compare it to, again, Amon Amarth in years to come. Maybe a little overlong and at times a bit too doomy, but if you want a unique listen on this list, this one is a must, so it is going to amazing. Then there's Accidental Suicide with Deceased. Another band on this list with just one full-length release. Unfortunately, in this case, the results don't pan out for me, despite being Milwaukee natives, where I spent a fair amount of time as a kid. They play into all of the worst elements of death doom that plagued all of my least favorite Autopsy albums. I find it all very dull and repetitious. There's an appropriate, miserable atmosphere, but it's not enough to keep me interested. Unknown is a killer track, though. I don't think it's quite at the bottom. I'm going to put it at okay tier. Then there's Sinister with Cross the Styx. Out of the Netherlands, these guys actually have 14 albums under their belt, this being number 1, but I feel like you rarely hear their name. And it's a shame too, because they really come in hot with this one. Killer drumming from primary member Odd Klustervoord, if I said that anywhere near correctly, and some pretty wicked guitar work too, with plenty of earworm hooks. Just a really tightly performed and constructed album. No bells and whistles, but honed to perfection. I'm gonna put it at fantastic. Then we have Obituary with The End Complete. Alan West coming back on guitar here from the debut. Certainly not a bad album, but it kind of feels like a rehash without the same impact. A few of these tracks are a little bit more on the bland side, like In the End of Life. There are some stronger parts too, but it's just not enough to keep me fully engaged. The drums sound great though. Maybe gonna piss some people off with this one, but I'm just putting this at good tier. Then we have Demigod with Slumber of Sullen Eyes. Getting the Finns up on the list here with their critically lauded debut album that Terrorizer also put in their top 40 death metal albums list. Full admission, I had not heard this prior to making the list, but that's a big part of why I do these. Not only do I get to get you excited about things you haven't heard, but also fill in some of my own blind spots. And man, is this a must listen. They take plenty of notes from their Swedish neighbors with the buzzsaw guitar tone and implementation of more melodic leads to spectacular effect. The Forlorn and Towards the Shredded Eternity are among my favorites on this one. It is going to perfection. Then we have Vital Remains with Let Us Pray. The The debut album from this Rhode Island death metal band I did a tier list for over a year ago. There's this very caveman aggression, but balanced out with some more blackened sounding synths and even Middle Eastern sounding melodies for a touch of class. Fun use of samples too. The riffs can get a little repetitive, especially on Pure Unholiness and Frozen Terror, but overall I enjoyed it. I'm gonna put it at great tier. Then there's Napalm Death with Utopia Banished. The band's last true death metal album before transitioning to more alternative groove and industrial influences for the remainder of the decade. Also the first album with Danny Herrera on drums. I'd say it's about on par with Harmony Corruption. I see some people put this one a bit lower, but I appreciate that they put a bit more grindcore speed back into this one. Better production too. Still not among my favorites from this band, but if you're just focusing on death metal of 1992, it's quite solid. So I'm gonna put it at amazing. Then we have Baphomet with The Dead Shall Inherit. I feel like this is a step down from the debut in that any of the interesting thrash and speed riffing and technical flourishes have been abandoned in favor of pretty paint-by-numbers death metal, to the point that when listening I kept thinking of the phrase, "we have Cannibal Corpse at home." There are some highlights like Valley of the Dead and Torn Soul, but for the most part I find this to be very dull, so putting it at meh. Then we have Nocturnus with Thresholds. A slight step down from the debut in my opinion, but there are still plenty of impressive technical and progressive performances here. They just feel a little bit more loose and chaotic early on, and the production doesn't always help either. Still love these synth elements on tracks like Nocturne in B minor and Aquatica, good groove on Arctic Crypt. The acoustic part on the latter also gives me proto-Opeth vibes. Love the thrash energy on Subterranean Infiltrator. Criticisms aside, still a cut above many of these, and I love the cover art, really setting the stage for other bands like Vector. I'm going to put it at fantastic. Then we have Messiah with Rotten Parish. Swiss death metalers back for album number 4 on this one, and only leaning further into some very death-sounding progressive death metal. This album has a seriously promising run of opening songs mixing complex performances with solid grooves. They lose me a little bit after lines of A Thought of a Convicted Man, with what I would consider to be some style over substance issues and meandering songwriting. But even so, there's a lot to soak in here and reflect on above your average death metal release. So I'm putting it at great tier. Then we have Order from Chaos with Stillbirth Machine. In many ways, I'd argue that this Kansas City band has more of a black metal sound, and it had an influence on the early scene in the US, but there's still plenty of death metal in there as well. Super raw, super primal, another one that feels more like I'm listening to a live performance a la Death Crush. Also very simplistic. I like it enough, but again, for this list, it just doesn't make much of a dent for me, so putting it at okay tier. Then we have Cemetery with An Evil Shade of Grey. Some more Swedish death metal with more melodic influences, loving the interplay of the lead guitars and synths for some more blackened vibes, also nice use of acoustic guitar on Where the Rivers of the Madness Stream and An Evil Shade of Grey, great drumming and pace changes on Dark Illusions. I tend to appreciate albums that take you on more of a dynamic journey, and this definitely does that in a very focused package. 8 songs, all of them equally engaging and memorable. It is going to perfection. Then there's Pertinence with Member of Immortal Damnation. The Finnish death metal debut coming in with emphasis on the doom on Black Vision, but it takes a few turns from there. One of the most unpleasant kick drum sounds, though, I've ever heard. The acoustic interlude is nice to break things up, but as a whole, the production on this is pretty off-putting, and then tracks like The Lost Memories are kind of a slog until you get to the good parts, so I'm gonna put this one at meh. Then there's Vader with The Ultimate Incantation. I'm a huge fan of this Polish death metal band, and while their debut isn't one of my favorites in their discography, its thrashy riffs are definitely worthy of the spotlight here, thanks in no small part to serious bangers like Dark Age and my personal favorite, Final Massacre. It may lack some of the more interesting and developed touches I like about later albums like Litany and Impressions in Blood, but man, is this record just thirsty for speed and aggression. It is going to fantastic. Then we have Polluted Inheritance with Ecocide. The first of just 3 albums from this Netherlands band, plenty of infectious chuggy guitar work that's definitely a highlight of the entire album, but I'm not really feeling the vocal performance and overall songwriting. There's some really headbang-worthy moments, but not a ton of tracks I really love all the way through. Lots of potential here, but the guitars just can't quite carry it alone, so it is going to okay. Then there's Impetigo with Horror of the Zombies. These Bloomington Madmen following up their 1990 debut with their second and final album, though they have done a number of splits and EPs going up to as recently as 2023. More death metal heavy on the grindcore influences and horror and gore imagery broken up by movie samples. I have to say though, the debut is just so unhinged and batshit insane that this feels a little bit more safe in comparison. But don't get me wrong, it's still ugly and insane, but I just find myself less intrigued with its particular brand of madness for whatever reason. Cannibal Ballet is pretty unique though. I'm going to put this one at good tier. Then we have Babylon Sad with Curie. Another group this is my first time hearing of. They are from Switzerland and only have this single record in their discography featuring former members of Messiah and also the drummer of even weirder technical band Mekong Delta. As such, they're another progressive band in the vein of Death, Atheist, and Cynic, but with a more avant-garde twist and synth player. It's a little clunky and uneven, and the spoken word parts are annoying, but I appreciate its very unique feel and overall atmosphere, so this one is also going to great tier. Then we have Lemming Project with Hate and Despise. One of just 2 full-length albums from this German death metal band, obscure enough that at the time of my note-taking here, there were no fan ratings from Metal Storm. All the more reason to hype them up to all of you here, though, because I really dig their early melodeath sound and would even argue that they give At the Gates a run for their money here. It has a similar sentiment and approach to both guitar and vocals, right up my alley. It's discovering albums again like this that makes me most excited to do these lists, as daunting as they can be. The ranking really is the least important part, but I'm going to put it at fantastic. Then we have God Dethroned with The Christ Hunt. The debut album from these Dutch death metalers, though not quite yet in their prime. You won't find this record on their Spotify page either. Solid guitar work, wicked soloing, and a whole lot of blast beats alongside some very reverb-soaked growls. There are some occasional surprise touches like the violin on Christ Carnage. Good, but it feels a little lacking in ultimate direction, so yeah, it's going to good tier. Then we have Atrocity with Todessehnsucht. A little more German death metal for you here with the title translating to Longing for Death. Definitely another weird one, combining elements of doom, technical death metal, and avant-garde into another one of the more memorable and impressive releases on this list, giving us plenty to chew on beyond the usual OSDM blueprint. Hearing plenty of influences from Death's more progressive era with them even outright covering their song Archangel, also elements of Atheist and Gorguts, though I don't think the songwriting is quite as strong. I'm going to put this one at amazing. Then we have Flesh Crawl with Descend into the Absurd. Another German band, but unfortunately one that really leans into the death doom. I find this album to be very bland and boring, and then there are parts like purulent, God, that word is so hard to say, bowel erosion that I find downright obnoxious. Frankly, this is one of my least favorites overall, putting it at meh. Then we have Gorefest with False. Killer Dutch death metalers returning with their sophomore album, and it is a slapper. The drums in particular really stand out here, both in performance and some crisp production that really makes each strike pop. But aside from that, the guitar work is also top-notch in its searing violence, more great mix of speed and atmosphere, really culminating in the epic closing harmonized leads of the Mass Insanity. The vocals could be a little better, but I love it otherwise, and it's a big step up from the debut. It is going to fantastic. In fact, I'm going to put it at the top of fantastic. Then we have Cenotaph with The Gloomy Reflection of Our Hidden Sorrows. The one Mexican death metal album on this list, featuring bass and vocals from Daniel Corchado of The Chasm and my favorite Incantation album, Diabolical Conquest. Unfortunately, this is another one that's a little too doomy for my taste. Some standout faster parts and fun little bass breaks here and there, but ultimately it just doesn't do a whole lot for me. I'm putting it at okay. Then we have Pan.Thy.Monium with Dawn of Dreams. Swedish avant-garde death metal led by producer extraordinaire and Hypocrisy member Dan Sueno on bass and keys. It can be a little doomy and kind of basic when it comes to guitar, but they make up for it with all these spooky effects and surprise blasts of organ, violin, and saxophone. Another incredibly unique listen, unlike anything else on this list, really. Part of me also wonders if it was an influence on groups like Imperial Triumphant, so it is going to amazing. Then we have Kumkan with Megatrends and Brutality. If you were wondering what Lars Goran Petrov was busy with during his temporary firing from Entombed, he acts as session vocalist on this album alongside fellow Swedes and band leaders Rasmus Ekman, Pelle Strom, and a drum machine credited as the imaginary Anders Green. It's got kind of a death and roll vibe to it with an interesting mix of grindcore D-beat and the more Swedish sounding guitars and atmosphere. The phrase that most comes to mind is fun, but a little sloppy, so I'm going to put it at good tier. Then there's Necrophiliac with Chaopula, Citadel of Mirrors. A little death metal from Spain on the menu here with their only album of the 90s. They wouldn't make a follow-up for another 28 years. My vote for the most demented vocals on this list, and maybe Bongo, as he goes by, just sounds like that, but it definitely feels like there's some effects work going on there too in some places. Credit also for some pretty wild album art here though from Luis Alfaro, and Cyclic Pathology of Natura is a jam. I'm going to put this one at okay. Then we have Sentinex with Subconscious Lobotomy. Another first-time record from Sweden, more use of early black metal sounding synths alongside more fairly standard sounding death metal. This is another one where the approach to songwriting gets on my nerves at times with just seeming to do the same thing over and over and over again, so it landed at meh tier. Then there's Seance with Forever Laid to Rest. Following up their debut demo in 1991, this is the Swedish band's first full-on LP, and it's a doozy. Great balance of speed, heaviness, and atmosphere, still feeling the impact of Left Hand Path, but they put their own more brutal twist on it, mixing in plenty of Cannibal Corpse energy as well. Great opener in Who Will Not Be Dead, and love the sudden pace change and very Rain in Blood sounding chugs on The Blessing of Death. Guitar work courtesy of current and former members of Witchery and The Haunted. Tight runtime too at just over 30 minutes. I'm putting it at great tier. Then there's Therion with Beyond Sanctorum. Like I said in the 91 ranking video, it's so interesting as a fan of this band's more modern material to hear them sound like something so far removed from that. Even so, they already have a better harnessing of atmosphere than a lot of bands on this list, and they are beginning to step into their symphonic wheelhouse with moody gothic tracks like Symphony of the Dead. But then they can also get just as heavy as anyone else here on others like Cthulhu. Super memorable riffs on that one. A few songs go on a bit too long, but other than that, it's a very interesting listen. I'm going to put it at amazing. Then there's Unleashed with Shadows in the Deep. I enjoyed this Swedish band's debut in the previous video, but I don't find myself quite as engaged with this one. It's a bit slower and more groove focused, and then the vocal patterns feel kind of lazy. That said, Shadows in the Deep is a head bobber. I can see why it's the most played track on the album by far, and I'm sure Amon Amarth again took some notes from this one. Neverending Hate is also good for something on the faster side. I'm going to put it at good tier, somewhere in here. And then we have Monstrosity with Imperial Doom. This Florida band debut features the one and only George Corpsegrinder Fisher on vocals prior to joining Cannibal Corpse, and he already gives a very strong performance here. And as if that wasn't enough, you also get John Rubin of Malevolent Creation and Jason Goebel of Cynic delivering some seriously sick guitar work ranging from more traditional, old-school flavor to progressive leanings. Hell of a drum performance too from Lee Harrison, also of Malevolent Creation. Just a full package here and captured with some pretty fantastic production for the time too. No wonder this was well received critically on release, and for me, I think it may actually be my favorite album on this entire list at perfection. So I was editing this video and I realized that in the chaos of handling all these files, I somehow lost track of Bolt Thrower with the Fourth Crusade, so we're gonna do that now. Solid dynamics, memorable riffs, and above all, the atmosphere is great. The opening title track sets this imposing, malevolent tone. Great drumming on Icon, too. I also dig the hooks on Where Next to Conquer, and this time it's War. I've given it a few chances at this point, but again, from a more objective standpoint, I get why people enjoy it. It just ultimately comes down to different strokes and personal taste for me. Again, I like my death metal fast and hard, and a lot of this is kind of like Molasses, though it does have some faster moments like Ritual. So all said and done, looking at this through the magic of editing, I think I'm going to put it kind of somewhere between great and amazing tier. And then, of course, we have Cannibal Corpse with Tomb of the Mutilated. Hammer Smash Face was one of the first death metal songs that I had ever heard, and just a masterclass of how to write brutal music that is somehow also catchy. Also, my first time seeing a death metal band, going all the way back to my Jim Carrey-filled childhood with Ace Ventura. And fortunately, it isn't a one-trick pony either, with other great tracks like Split Wide Open. Some awesome D-beats, and also some thrashier riffs and wicked bass, and probably some of the wildest track names in their career that I'm just not going to read this time because I learned my lesson when I did the Cannibal Corpse discography tier list that ended up with limited ads. If you ask me, this is a huge step up from Butchered at Birth, and easily my favorite of the Barnes era. Pretty crisp production, too, for the time. So, it also has to go to perfection. Y'all check out this playlist for more of these death metal rankings and also rankings by bands within their discography. And again, let me know down in the comments what were your favorites. Subscribe if you're new here. And yeah, that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.